Ladies and gentlemen, your host, Derek Lambert of MythVision podcast. We are MythVision. Welcome back to my podcast. We're going to be talking about the resurrection of Jesus. Host Derek Lambert. Oh, I've got a little bit of reverb here. There we go. Okay. So I had a window open. Forgive me on that noise there. I once was an open proponent speaking boldly about the resurrection of Jesus. I had believed that Jesus actually rose from the dead, that he was the Son of God, God in the flesh. I was a Trinitarian, and I seriously believed this with all my heart, right? I had an emotional, spiritual experience in my life where I thought this was confirmation that this is true, and I attached that emotional attachment, if you will, to a book. So I had believed that Jesus rose from the dead, and this was really true. Of course, nothing else was true. All the other world religions, no, there was only one way. It was Jesus. So I have done the opposite. The light switch has been turned on, and now critical thinking skills have been applied to my own worldview to a point where now I'm boldly outspoken against the thing I once held. I was wrong. I admit this. I was mistaken. And now I'm speaking against the very thing I once held sacred. So I want anyone who's watching, if you're a Christian and you're watching, please consider what we're saying today. Actually take in what we're saying. This will be a video series on the takedown of the Easter story. It will be a close scalpel on this narrative. And first and foremost, we're going to be dealing with things prior to getting into the actual text and dealing with the data. You need to consider some things before you go swallowing this pill that you're not even sure what you're swallowing. And with that being said, let's get the intro started with our guest. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Derek Lambert, once again, your host. The resurrection of Jesus. This cannot be done in one video, especially if we want to do a thorough takedown, a critical examination of the text, of the story about a man named Jesus Christ, who's supposedly God, but we'll put that to the side right now. We're going to introduce our guest, and our guest is Jonathan M.S. Pierce. Welcome to MythVision, my friend.
I can die happy now because I have fulfilled my lifelong ambition of appearing in the same video as a naked Jesus, and there is no greater privilege. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. You know, sometimes I come off with comedy and sometimes I'm more serious, and I think we're going to try and do both a bit here, but this is a serious situation. We have 2 billion people on planet Earth approximately who think this story is historically true. I, for one, was one of them. I was an outspoken proponent. I believed it. I bashed my own family using the Bible. And I mean that literally. Like, I thought I was right, and they needed to see this was true, or else God was going to burn them in hell. They were going to either send themselves to hell, depending on the evangelical point of view, or God was going to do so because they didn't really believe. They needed to. And I pushed this. I pushed it on myself. I pushed it on other people. Now I'm flipping the script. I want to push it out there and let people know I was wrong, but you're going to help me do that. And I'd love for you to point this out.
Yes, so there are elements to belief that are absolutely necessary to take into account. So one of them is psychology. So we talked before this started about how you used to try and convince people to buy Samsung phones instead of Apple phones in a previous job you had, and there was a lot of pushback there. And you were presenting them with actual data as to why the Samsung phone in that particular instance was better than the Apple phone, and people aren't receptive to fact and to content. They're receptive to the sort of people who are talking to them, and the whole idea of belief is largely psychological. So we're not going to be dealing with that per se, certainly in the early parts of this conversation, but it's always worth bearing that in mind, that it's very difficult to reason people out of a position they haven't reasoned themselves into. But we are going to be talking about the content here as far as the resurrection is concerned. Now, I wrote this book, The Resurrection, a critical examination, and the genesis of this book, my one's better than yours.
I was going to say mine's is better. That's for sure. There's no way. You can't. It's got more highlights. It's got more highlights. I've got red stickies though. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
So why did I write that? Well, so it goes back to 2012. I wrote the book, The Nativity: A Critical Examination, and what I look to do with that is see the intersection of the gospel claims with known history, and also the coherence of the gospel claims with themselves. In that case, only Luke and Matthew report the nativity, right? So I looked at that and found that actually, historically speaking, there's no credibility to the nativity claims at all, right? So what happens then when you take that historical rug from out from under the feet of the believer and the gospel claims? What do you do with the theology? What do you hang the theology on? There's this great Catholic exegete, biblical scholar called Raymond Brown, and he broadly agreed that there were historical problems with the nativity accounts, right? But then said that there was still this theological verisimilitude. You could still find this theological truth. And I'm like, I'm not sure that you can do that. If you're saying, right, and this is going back to the nativity, if you're saying that Jesus was the new Moses, out of Egypt I will call my son Israel, and you're having the Herod being the Pharaoh and the slaughter of the innocents being a retelling of the killing of the firstborn, right? If you're then saying this didn't actually happen, so Herod didn't actually kill those children, and Jesus didn't actually go to Egypt for 2 years to come out of Egypt in order to fulfill the prophecy, then what are you theologically saying? And how can you say that? Because you're saying, okay, I admit that this really didn't historically happen, but Jesus is still some kind of Moses figure. And then, so having then done that with the Nativity, I've then done that with the Resurrection book, because here are the bookends of Jesus' life, right? You have his Nativity and his death and resurrection. And if you can take the historical credibility away from those two moments, those two events, then and say, well, this didn't really happen, then what does it say about all the rest of his life, his entire ministry, where he's the wedding at Cana, for example? Like, who was there? How do we know? So if you're saying that here are the two times that Jesus' life intersect with history, right, and they fail, those claims, how can you believe the rest of his life? And what does this make Jesus? Is he just then an itinerant preacher doing interesting things?
You bring up in the book right early on, I really recommend, you can see it here. Obviously, I have it here. I've even got a better image to show you guys what the book looks like. If you want, you can actually go to his website, which I have in the description, right? He has a blog. He goes in depth, like here, we're live at MythVision right now. He's talking about his resurrection book here. He has lots of blogs that he writes, as well as you can get his publications there, or you can go in the description and check him out on Amazon. He's got the Nativity, which is the book he's describing here about the birth of Jesus. All right. Is this accurate? Is this historically reliable? And it leads right into the resurrection. Technically, I feel like they're one and the same if you want to be orthodox, but the most potent of doctrines is the resurrection, because Paul talks about this clearly, saying, if this is not true, if he did not raise, then we are we're screwed. Everything we're saying is BS. And that's really what you open up in your book, clear as day. For those who haven't subscribed to my Patreon, early access, you guys ask questions. I go to visit scholars. I'm going to see Del Allison next 2 months from now. I'm going next month to see Dr. Richard Carrier if you have questions for him. Dr. Dennis R. McDonald if you have questions for them. In-person interviews all week with these guys. If you're a Patreon member, you can ask a question. I will record a personal video of your question with these scholars joining my Patreon. Also, there's hundreds of videos that have never been released to the public. There's so much stuff. So you're helping us out, right? All right, getting into the content here, Jonathan. Paul said if it didn't happen,
well,
that's it.
so but before I come on to that, because that is the starting place, but let's look at a little bit more at the foundations. So as part of a trilogy of books, I'm presently writing a book called working title The Exodus, a critical examination of the Moses story, right? So my whole brain at the moment, forgive me, is in Exodus, and the historicity of that account. And doing exactly the same thing, which is to say that okay, if this didn't happen in Jesus' life and this didn't happen, but all of this is built on a foundation of Mosaic law. If Jesus is fulfilling every jot and tittle of the law, right, and Christianity is effectively a Jewish sect in its infancy, then let's look at how the foundations of that are set, and to do that, you've got to look at the Exodus. Really, it's all about the Exodus, because after that, you then get the establishment of the law, of which Jesus is the fulfillment. And historically, they are also, that the whole narrative is incredibly fragile, right? There is basically, and you've done heaps of videos with some fantastic scholars that have shown this recently. And the great Josh Bowen, who is a good friend of yours, is going to write the foreword for my Exodus book. So I'm really stoked about that. I interviewed him recently because it turns out we have some quite similarities. We're both sort of agnostic atheists. We both got twins. We both got multiple sclerosis. So forgive me for my sins if I forget things today. And he's good looking and I'm exceptionally good looking. and so, the similarities. So he's going to write the foreword. But the point being that when you take this all away, what have you got left? What can you hold on to? So some modern liberal Christians are happy to say, do you know what? Okay, the Old Testament is broadly mythological. The nativity, I can say that didn't happen. I believe Raymond Brown, and it's got some issues. And the resurrection, there are some issues there. Okay, fair enough. But then how do you sustain your belief? What are you holding your theology on? It's hugely problematic.
Yeah, I even already saw one of the live chat. By the way, if you're watching live, as we go through this little presentation with Jonathan, if you have a question that's pertinent to the topic at hand, I'll be happy to try and ask that question if you want to super chat that. If not, I'll take questions at the end and we'll go from there. Of course, super chats get front of the line, so I'll try to focus on that. That helps me grow. But you're 100% right. One of the commenters said, well, that's not historical. The value, we talked about this yesterday, the value isn't that the guy rose from the dead, which would be like ignoring orthodoxy from day one, right? Like they got it wrong from the start. So all Christianity is a bunch of hogwash, according to those who are willing to go so far as say he didn't really rise from the dead. There's a moral to the story.
It becomes a moral assertion. So all that happens is those Christians are claiming, and effectively it's therefore really secular moral assertion. You're saying here's some moral framework that's true, not because it's based and rooted in reality, but because I'm merely asserting it true and then connecting it to some kind of false mythical reality.
Well, and what's interesting is you could do that with anything. You could do that with any mythos. You could do that with Paul Bunyan. You could do that with a soldier who recently went and sacrificed his life to try and save another soldier in the middle of combat. You could do that with anything. So why do we cherish this particular book or try to defend it to a point where we're like, let's make it allegory. Let's make it something that, he didn't really die and rise from the dead or something. It's what they believed about this is what we're going to be jabbing. But before we get into the details, you said we need to delve into maybe some Bayesian stuff or going prior to why even believe this to begin with. We need to stop before we even get into the text, right?
Yeah. So I suppose the first thing, so if I share with you, if I may, I suppose what we need to do is establish that the resurrection is important. Okay. So in order to do that, it's probably worth going to Paul. Paul is our earliest source for Jesus, and therefore is incredibly important. If we take sort of Paul writing shortly after the death of Jesus, then he is clearly the earliest source, and in some sense, one might claim the most reliable. Then he says, and this is quite repetitive, now if Christ is preached that he has been raised from the dead, how do some among you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, not even Christ has been raised, and if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is vain, your faith also is vain. Moreover, we are even found to be false witnesses of God, because we witnessed against God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless, you are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If we have hoped in Christ in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied. And then, so that's Paul establishing essentially that the resurrection is super important, okay? And then you can go to, this is just from some generic apologist website. So Blue Letter Bible, right? Says Christian preaching is empty, and this is if the resurrection isn't true. And so is anyone's faith, because the object of the faith, Christ, is not whom he said he was. The apostles are liars for testifying something that didn't occur. No forgiveness is being granted for sin. Those who have died believing in Christ have died with no hope. And if hope in Christ is limited to this life, then Christians are to be pitied above all people. So what I'm doing in saying that is the importance of the resurrection, right? So, for example, when you were a Christian, Derek, really, I assume, a very fundamentalist Christian in some sense, how important was the resurrection to you?
I mean, that was how I knew I was forgiven, the way I understood it. In fact, when I was first presented it in middle school, it was, have you told a lie? And I had a really traumatic life growing up with an alcoholic father. So there was serious reasons to want a father that was perfect, that wouldn't hurt me or cause harm to me and stuff. And so they gave
psychology, the psychology.
Big time. They gave me that, have you told a lie? Yeah, I've told a lie. If you told a lie, you told a lie about the lie. And then they led it into, don't worry, that was all taken upon Jesus on the cross. And if he was crucified and didn't rise, then really none of that was taken. But because he rose, all that guilt and shame you experience emotionally, psychologically, has all been taken. So get rid of it. You can purge it because it's all been put on him. It was the most important part of the story, that he actually had the power to forgive me, because it's all about us, for the things that I've done. And so that's how important it was.
So people like William Lane Craig, you recognize this, they would say pretty openly that just like Paul, obviously, if you take away the resurrection, then kind of you're not left with anything sort of particularly as meaningful, right? The meaning of the interesting question is, why did Jesus exist, right? Why Jesus? And the answer to why Jesus is death and resurrection. Yeah, because otherwise all you're left with is a guy doing miracles randomly around Galilee and Jerusalem and whatnot, and they're 10 a penny, right? At least people who claim to have done these things, and around the world for time, eternal. So I think the resurrection is massively, massively important. So therefore, if you're saying, okay, the resurrection is the be all and end all, so let's critically analyze it, and the claims that are made about it by Paul and the Gospels, actually you can forget all that, because it comes back to the atonement. So in the book, I talk about how the atonement makes no sense, right? And since it makes no sense, the resurrection, you almost don't need to bother looking into the details of the resurrection, because without the atonement making sense, the resurrection doesn't make sense. The resurrection supervenes upon the coherence of the atonement. So when you were a Christian, what was your understanding of the atonement, for example?
I had the idea that he died specifically in my place. This was, first it was just a regular evangelical church, but still had a similar atonement idea, even as Calvinist. We just took it a little further when I became Calvinist. But what is the particular technical theological term for him dying as his blood particular poured out for my sins? What is that?
So you've got various different theories. You've got satisfaction theories, and you've got penal substitution.
Substitution, I believe it is.
Yeah. Yeah, so again, there are different forms of substitution, and this is the point, right?
Right.
The point is that you have all these different theories of atonement, okay, and no Christian particularly agrees on them. They fall in line with whatever your particular denomination is, and actually they're probably determined by what politics you're involved with as well. So it turns out that if you're more sort of a right-wing conservative evangelical, you'll favor a penal substitution theory, which is sort of,
vicarious atonement. Sorry,
yeah,
someone said,
yes,
that's the one.
Yeah. And if you're more liberal, I don't know, sort of a Democrat Christian who believes in Jesus being the lovey-dovey form of Jesus, right? Then you're going to favor something like the moral example theories, where Jesus is presenting himself as an example to humanity, and that changes the way that we act, and So there are all these different theories, but no one agrees, right? And that's a problem. But let's take it a step back, right?
Okay.
Because Christians will generally agree that God is in the classical understanding of theism. Classical theism is that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, right? So if God has ultimate responsibility for designing and creating humanity, and the idea with most atonement theories is that God has designed and created humanity with the full foreknowledge that they would do wrong, would be imperfect. In fact, he's designed them in such a way that they are imperfect, right? Then humanity goes out and does imperfect things, and then God punishes them for doing that. And then God requires payment to balance the books for them doing that.
Right.
So it's a bit like me selling you a car, Derek, that I have designed and created, right? And it's a crap car, and I'm going to sell it to you, and you're going to drive it around, and it's going to go wrong, and it's going to kill some people in a car crash, and it'll be the fault of my design and my creation, right?
And then they'll try to. I want to jab back so that we can really deep dive for the Christians who are automatically already trying to apologetic in their head.
Yeah.
Great point. So they'll go, for example, and we're going to point out the flaws in this. No. The God did not design it flawed. It was right, but the man that bought or ends up with the vehicle messed up the vehicle, which caused the vehicle to crash. And the problem is God's foreknowledge. This is going to get right into the root of the problem.
So I've always said that divine foreknowledge is the biggest thorn in the side of Christians or theistic believers, because actually it invalidates almost all of the defenses that Christians come up with. And so that's why things like open theism have developed as a theology, which is to say that God doesn't know like the outcomes of freely willed decisions, which will then solve certain problems here. But as we talked about before, personally, sometimes solutions for a problem cause more problems elsewhere. And so open theism doesn't fit with lots of the biblical text and blah, 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 blah. But the problem is, if God fully knows that humans will do X, Y, and Z, but creates them anyway, then there is some kind of will of God wanting that to take place. And if he's omnipotent, he should be able to, and omniscient, he should be able to know how to have it elsewise, right?
If I may comment as to why I came to the conclusion I did as a Calvinist, I became a supralapsarian because I wasn't trying to make up stuff to protect God. I thought God doesn't need any protecting as a Christian. I said most Calvinists aren't even consistent. So I wanted to be the most consistent I could be as a Calvinist. And here's what I accepted. In Isaiah, I create light, I create darkness. I create good, I create evil. I, the Lord, create all these things, right? This is God's creation. So I went ahead and swallowed, I thought, I don't think that pill completely dissolves in your stomach, by the way. I tried to swallow the massive horse pill of God created all of this. He creates evil. He creates good. He created people for destruction, as we see in Romans 9 with Paul. He creates vessels for glory, as we see in Romans 9. I'm a consistent Calvinist, right? So it was part of his plan that we would fall. And this is why Revelation says, I would jump around, the Lamb who was slain before the foundations of the world. So this was all part of the plan, that Christ would come and die for the sins of humanity, that God created us so that we would fall, and he would condemn most of his creation to burn in hell. So I did not believe God was omnibenevolent. He was omnibenevolent to his chosen, but he wasn't omnibenevolent because it didn't make sense to me in my mind, even though it's common grace, and then there's specific grace. And it's like, they're making up all these categories to try and make God still all loving.
So it gets to these discussions, which I find fascinating, which is, why would God create something that just plays out exactly how he knows it will play out? What's the joy in creating, right? There's no lack of knowledge about what will happen. And then if you can actually take that a step further, you could posit that God actually has full experiential knowledge in advance, which is to say that God could experience what it was like to create a particular thing without having to create it. So, and this would invalidate suffering. Okay, so God knows that suffering is going to take place in whatever creation he has, right? So rather than creating world X, which has loads of suffering, since God would know the outcome of world X and could actually feel all of the experience and experience all the experience of creating world X without actually creating it, then he should just sit back and go, I don't need to create, because I can just experience it here, because by creating, I am actually creating suffering necessarily. You know, if I know, and so it goes back to this situation, like the car analogy. So if God has moral culpability. So to finish the car analogy I was going to do with
Please, I sorry I interrupted you.
No, because actually it reminds me of another analogy. So the car analogy is that here's a car that I know will go wrong, that will crash and cause problems, and I'm selling it to you. And then 5 years later, I come back to you, Derek, and I said, you know, that car was imperfect. I demand that you balance the books. I demand something outside of me, you or somehow some other third party is balancing the books for my imperfect creation. And you're there saying, hang on, like, how come this is up to me? Or how come this is up to a third party? Jesus, or how do the books need to be balanced for something that you have the ultimate responsibility over? Imagine you, Derek, are a scientist in a lab, right? You create a sentient being in some test tubes, okay? And you know 100% indubitably that when you let this sentient being go outside into the town, they will rape and pillage and cause destruction. Right. Some of them might do some nice things. Some of them might paint paintings and do some charity work. But this sentient life form that you create goes out, and you know 100% it will destroy things. So when the police come knocking at your door and say, Mr. Scientist, you knowingly created these things and they went out to destroy stuff, the police would rightfully say you are in some sense morally culpable for these creations.
Yes.
God is, and I contest that there is a way out of this, but I see that God is ultimately responsible for any shortcomings of humanity. We didn't choose how. It's interesting. We didn't design ourselves.
If you buy into this, right? If you buy into this narrative, yes, you're right. According to the book, according to the whole system of really Judaism and Christianity, and even if you go into Islam. So all the Abrahamic faiths are all tied in exactly what you're talking about here. Yes.
Yeah. So what I do in the book here is, before going into the details of it, and we're unlikely to talk in this particular meeting today, this conversation today, about the details of the resurrection in the Gospels. This is laying out the groundwork. This is looking at methodologies, looking at a little bit of philosophy and theology to say that the atonement doesn't make sense. It doesn't matter which version of atonement you have, because if God is ultimately responsible for designing and creating literally everything other than God, then why is he demanding a balancing of the books? Why does he need some kind of payment? You could maybe get away with arguing that actually Jesus being sacrificed is to morally improve humanity in some kind of moral exemplar theory. That may be about the only one that could be vaguely coherent with this idea of God being ultimately responsible for designing and creating humanity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, but even then, just a moral example. I mean, that shouldn't change the whole world. I don't see how that would. Why would you need to push around hell or heaven then? Stop preaching that whole idea. I don't see the point.
You're absolutely right. So, and other problems with atonement theories are things like, so if you believe in a real and literal Satan, okay, which is hugely problematic, then for reasons I'll tell you in a second, but some of the ransom theories of atonement are that we are shackled, we're in bondage to Satan or whatever, and Jesus' sacrifice somehow pays the ransom or frees us, Christ is the victor or whatever. You get these different sort of theories that posit that Satan is holding us, in bondage, or we sin because of him. But here's the thing: if God is omnipotent, right, then he could destroy Satan in a click of a fingers, right? That should be within his ability range. So that Satan does anything. So any theist that comes up to you and says, oh, this happens because Satan, or the fossils are planted because of Satan, first thing you need to say is God could destroy Satan just like that. Okay. That he doesn't is a sign that Satan is providing a service for God. Satan is, as I've written before, God's management executive. Right, so God has outsourced some services to Satan, which Satan provides, that God allows. There's something called omissive will. So instead of instead of killing 230,000 people himself, God, he allows a tsunami to take place in 2004, right? But he doesn't do anything to stop it. That's omissive will. That's the same as actually killing them. Right. If you could stop it but don't, it's the same as Satan. If you could stop Satan but don't, you are allowing Satan to do what he wants for a particular reason. Now, whatever that reason could be, we could discuss that. But the idea is that Satan is hugely problematic. You can't lay anything at the feet of Satan, because it eventually is at the feet of God himself. Does that make sense as well?
Oh, yeah. There's major problems with this. That's why when I went to the position I did, I used to have this whole Satan's battling with God concept as a Christian, and we used to have spiritual warfare where we would cast out demons and try to battle the devil and stuff. I'm not even kidding you. We spoke in tongues, we did all that, but eventually I became it was definitely exciting. I witnessed some real crazy psychological stuff going on in the house church there, but eventually becoming Calvinist, where I was like, okay, Satan actually works for God. That's the position I started to take, because I wanted to solve these foreknowledge issues and these, like, is there a problem with what's actually happening? No, I argued with Calvinists there weren't two wills of God. I argued there was one, and what happened was what God wanted to happen.
Absolutely has to be that way. If you believe that God is sovereign, fully sovereign, and has ultimate power, then there is no way of escaping that. Yeah,
you're right. Because you run into dilemmas like, well, God wills and wants and desires all men to be saved, right? And they want to universalize that to everyone, right? Okay, has all men been saved? No. So if God really wants that, God has failed to get what he really wants, and I couldn't accept that. So I was trying to be as consistent, but God then became beyond. I couldn't put moral attributes I had to put all the moral attributes together, but then I had to go, does God really experience emotions at this point? Because how could someone do it? It gets real crazy. You start to get into loony land in your head to try and understand God.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree that it's a real problem. If I was a Christian, I would be a universalist without any shadow of a doubt. It's the only thing that makes moral sense. But then you're wondering why create at all if I don't know. We could spend hours debating this. So
yeah.
So the atonement. So the notion is the atonement doesn't make sense. Okay. So then we come on to the Holy Trinity, right? And the resurrection also supervenes on the coherence of the Holy Trinity, because if you don't believe that Jesus is God, then nothing really makes sense of the resurrection, or at least not in modern conceptions. Because I would argue, and this is something we'll come on to later, that Mark, Matthew, and Luke didn't believe Jesus was God. I think they believed he was a Messiah, just like like Paul did as well. It's only until John comes along and further theological, machinations take place that the idea of the Holy Trinity develops. But for modern conceptions of how the resurrection works, you need a coherent notion of the Holy Trinity. And yet the most prevalent theory of the Holy Trinity is something called Mysterianism, which is, I don't know how it works, I just have faith that it works.
Yeah.
You're like, that's not good enough for me. It's like God the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit, same but different. Like 3 parts, but not 3 parts, because that's heresy and I get burned at the stake. Do you know what I mean? It's like, well, give me some, like, you can't just give me a promissory note that it must work. I've got a good enough brain to be able to decipher how the Holy Trinity should work. Surely.
Yeah, you bring that out in your book. Yeah, you bring this out in your book, and there's so much that could be said about this. The thing about your book is it's not exhaustive in that's a good thing, because you can get lost in the weeds on the Trinity. For example,
Yeah.
Jesus doesn't know the day or the hour, but the Father and the Holy Spirit have an idea, or maybe the Holy Spirit doesn't even know, because he says only my Father who's in heaven. So the Holy Spirit and Jesus are kind of left with ignorance, and yet the Father's the only one who has it, or the Holy Spirit's one and the same as the Father. No wonder the early church fathers were going and trying to figure this out.
Yeah, exactly. How can you be fully God and not fully God? You know, because but by saying that, you're admitting that he's not fully God, right? He doesn't have all the attributes that we would associate with full divinity, right? But then you're saying, but he is fully man and fully God. Well, okay, but then if he's fully man, then where did his male DNA come from? And it's just like, but of course, my opinion would be that actually the stories that were embellished throughout time, from Paul through Mark, Matthew, and Luke, I would argue don't see him as a god. So therefore, it makes sense more as a messianic figure. So I think the early followers thought he was merely a Messiah, which makes so much more sense of the Gospels. And it's only when you get John comes along and says, in the beginning, there was a word. And then we have this divinity developing.
So if I may, for our audience, this is part one of this series. I want you guys to understand we're building up. We're talking about necessary things that you will engage with a Christian on at some point, if you're ever going to, that are pertinent to this discussion for Christians.
Yeah.
We're getting into something prior to getting into the details, because the further episodes we're going to do on this topic, we're going to be opening up the Bible. We're going to go to the text. We're going to point out within their message why you should be hesitant and not be so confident in believing in this story that I once cherished with everything that I thought was my being. I mean, I literally was obsessed with this, like a drug addiction. So, if you will, I figure with what you just said about him starting off as a Messiah type figure, some Christians will argue, no, we could see divinity notions in Mark. We see ideas of divinity. Is it possible that it's demigod type concepts?
Well, there are so many different I mean, there are many different Christianities. There's many different Christianities there are Christians, and you can develop whatever theory you want. I just think the best understanding of how the Gospels developed and were embellished, and what seems like the theology in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, I think is best explained by they don't think he's actually God.
Right.
And Bart Ehrman talks about this in how Jesus became God, and he talks about the sort of exaltation. So the different versions of how Paul, for example, understood Jesus, and I think he does a really good job there. So I would go along with Bart Ehrman with that and say that makes sense, and because that's obvious, which is if you were following, like at the time, at most, Jesus' followers would have been thinking, this guy is amazing, right? He is the Messiah. We are Jews. We are living within a Jewish culture, and we are adhering to Judaism. This guy is to me a Messiah, right? In the classic sense of the word. Now, although he wasn't a militaristic leader, so they were already thinking, well, he's a bit of a different Messiah. Then he goes and gets killed, and then they go, my goodness, how do we understand this? This is something we'll talk about a lot later in the series. But how do we understand this? Oh my God, I wasn't expecting him to die. Now I have to go back to the Hebrew Bible and start looking through it to understand what we've just experienced, to see if you can have a Messiah figure who is a dying Messiah figure, who then rises as some kind of divine entity, like angelic entity, who then resurrects and rises. And again, to repeat myself, John then comes along and says, no, this is different. Actually, Jesus was God. And then you get the development of the Holy Trinity that comes later. But I think that's a natural progression that I think we can see through the early church.
Okay, so two things that I think are pertinent to the subject as we're going through this. I'm not trying to cut through your notes because you might have something you want to share, but is cognitive dissonance is number one that we're really going to be deep, like especially later in the series, you're going to want to stick around to see what the church did, what these writers in the New Testament are doing, what happened, cognitive dissonance. And number two, you brought up something about him being God. All right. Some people will talk about demigod concepts. Some people will say this is God himself, right? John chapter 1:1. Some will argue this is God, right? Clearly. The problem is this. People will say there were no dying and rising gods, right? This is one of the things you bring up in your book. You quote Richard Carrier here, and this is where I love it. Why would Justin Martyr be saying what he's saying if there weren't these ideas before Christianity floating around about dying and rising gods?
So what you find with when people invent things, okay, just anything. If I was to say to you, or if I was to say to one of my kids, right, go and invent a monster, right, they will sit down and they will give me the head of something, the tail of something, and the body of something else, right? Some kind of chimera, which is that we're not very good at inventing things out of pure cloth, because if the concept doesn't already exist, like, we aren't just going to just invent a whole new concept.
Right.
Do you want conceptually? That's really, really difficult. So we always rely on sources, on ideas that already exist, and we take ideas and we change them. This is the beauty of the Hebrew Bible, right? So the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the when you understand it, when you're not constrained by hyperliteralism, right? So, which is a problem for the New Testament and the Old Testament, which is, I can only understand this book in one way. It is hyperliterally true, right? That's a huge problem. When you understand it in its anthropological context, in the cultural milieu in which it's set, if you understand the ancient Near East, then you're saying, I'm taking this idea, but the importance is not in the similarities between the idea that I'm now making and the previous idea. The importance comes in the differences.
Exactly.
So it's, what do I change about that? So that you as the audience will recognize that and go, yeah, I get that. Oh, that's what you changed. I like it. So quite often Christians will say they can't be relying on other sources because actually there are differences. Whereas the skeptic should say, no, the differences are exactly what it's not to say if it's completely different, it's related. There has to be some core of similarity, but the differences are what are giving you the meaning. It's how the author changes things that give you the meaning. So going to the New Testament, if you're taking ideas about dying and rising gods, but then you're saying, but here's how I'm selling it and here's how I'm adapting it for this theology, then you are presenting a new idea in a sense, but it's not being created out of pure nothing.
If I may read from your book, Precedents, you say, resurrecting deities is not an uncommon motif in ancient religions. This is nothing new, and so the idea that some truth value can be extracted from claims due to them being wild or original has no purchase. As Richard Carrier, with a PhD in ancient history, points out, here's Richard Carrier. Indeed, resurrection was wildly popular among the pagans. Of course, it was already a common Jewish staple, with past resurrection in its sacred stories and future resurrections in its imagined plan of salvation. But the claim that all pagans scoffed at the idea is simply false. The idea of a future resurrection for all the saved actually derives from pagan Zoroastrianism, then the Persian state religion, which had influenced many popular cults in Roman Empire, including Mithraism and religious Stoicism. Indeed, it's from them that the Jews got the idea in the first place, having picked it up when they were in captivity in Persia several centuries before Christianity began. And I don't know if you want me to finish reading this, but it's just, where I'm going. I really want to tease everyone. You've got to get this. This is on page 24 of his book. And then I just want to mention Justin Martyr real quick, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You say the mention of Justin Martyr is pertinent since the early church father declared to early Jews and Christians, when we say that the Word, who is our teacher, Jesus Christ, the firstborn of God, was produced without sexual union, and that he was crucified and died and rose again and ascended to heaven, we propound nothing new or different from what you believe regarding those whom you consider sons of God. Given the context, you say, within which Christianity was set, and looking at it in a secular anthropological manner, a dying and resurrecting God is something you could and arguably would expect. Now, this is building up. All this, like, we're not even there yet, guys. You're just hearing us chip away to let you know why we need to start off skeptical, because you're going to get into soon, I suspect, into what the hell, man? Like, why are we even arguing this problem? It really makes no sense.
We'll return to that particular point about which it talks about prior probability. So when we have precedents for something, and every single instance of that, everyone accepts was not historical reality, so all these other dying and rising gods weren't actually dying and rising gods, then we'll talk about the probability and how we assess that going forward in a little while. But you're absolutely right. Precedence is a hugely important thing. So what I would look to do, and we've already talked for however long we've talked, but here are the aims across the series of what I would, and the aims of the book, really. So having already set out some issues like atonement, Holy Trinity, and saying, right, they are really so problematic as to be terminal. But if, as a Christian, you're happy to park those, right? If you're going to park those for a bit, now let's get on to the actual claims of the Gospels. I don't think you can park them. I think it's terminal for the resurrection case. But let's just, for the sake of argument, go there. So here are my aims. 1, the claims of the resurrection are incredible claims that require very good quality evidence. 2, the Gospels are not reliable sources of information. They are poor quality evidence. 3, if untrue, then what might have taken place? What hypothesis can better explain the data? So what we're going to be doing now is saying, right, let's look at this idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Then let's look at this being a set of extraordinary claims. And are the Gospels and Paul extraordinary evidence? No, they're not. What is a better hypothesis of the data, i.e. the gospel claims? What can better explain the gospel claims other than Jesus, as a God-man spirit, really did die and resurrect to sit on his own right hand for eternity?
His own right hand. You make a point in the book to be a little funny. You're like, I could just go on and say God sent himself to die to pay off his, like you did the whole Jesus is talking to himself in the garden thing. And I thought that was really funny, but you're like, I'm not going to do that. So I'm just saying I could just laugh this thing off.
Yeah, so some of it is metaphorical. Obviously, Jesus, sitting on the right hand of God is a metaphorical statement. But it's this idea that God sends himself down to sacrifice himself to himself in order to pay for something that he created, so that he can come up to heaven and sit on his own right hand for eternity in paradise. And you're like, well, A, that's just completely bizarre, and B, is that, we talked about this a little bit, was that really a sacrifice?
Right.
Who's he paying? I know real humans throughout the world, stories of people who have suffered hugely over a vast amount of years in terrible circumstances that I would argue, because they're not omnipotent, right? I would argue that their suffering is greater. But of course, a Christian comes back to say, actually, this is the infinite, pain of God for the sins of humanity. And
in your book too, I just want everyone to know the argument Christians will bring up is free will. This is their magnum opus, so to speak, on how they can escape. And they don't escape. There's not an escape. I could read a quote, but you really should get the book. I do want to read about the whole, what you say about the whole theory of scapegoat and propitiation, the different theories of what the sacrifice is for. And you say in concluding remarks, as you could see, there are many competing theories to explain why Jesus, as a Messiah, would end up being crucified instead of leading the chosen people to some messianic victory in the more obvious short term. None of them is relevant. If you take seriously the terminal issues with the classic notion of God, particularly if you believe he has divine foreknowledge. Furthermore, although not discussed in this chapter, the Hebrew Bible categorically refutes these ideas of atonement, and you give the Old Testament. What we see here is this is true whether you are an ardent believer or a skeptic. Are early Christian thinkers trying desperately to make theological sense of the data in the centuries after the death of Christ, to the point that the theologians are still, to this day, producing refined or new theories. And remember, many of these these theories are believed to the exclusion of others, so that a modern adherent to a moral example theory must believe that all previous Christians who adhered to other incorrect theories didn't actually understand why Christ died, arguably. And it just points out no one really knows. No one has the answer on this question, but just as soon as you go to a church, you hear that pastor preach. Yeah. Oh, they know. They're telling you the truth.
Here's a slight side point. This is a tangent. I do apologize. I'll make it quick. But if you have to study theology for a PhD, in fact, for your life, if you're someone like Raymond Brown that studied for like 30, 40, 50 years, learns however many different languages, Hebrew, Greek, blah, blah, blah. you have to have the brain to be able to do that. You have to be in a luxurious enough situation to be able to do that. And the commitment and all these attributes to put yourself in that position to learn all those things, so that you are in the best position to properly access the best version of the revelation, to properly access God and God's love, and to be in the best union with God as possible. Then Christianity is elitist. There's just no way out of it. You know, like if all of that is so that you can better understand the revelation, then that's just pure elitism. And for your everyday Joe who doesn't have the time or maybe even the acumen to do that, then it's unfair, because you are inherently unable to access the best version of the revelation as possible. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. There's probably going to be some Christians who will see this and they're going to think you and me have no damn clue what we're talking about. I honestly think the cognitive dissonance is that potent. I would have thought that of us 9 years ago as a Christian. I would have thought, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know God. You don't know Christ, right? You don't understand this book. You're not reading it properly. These are all the things that we would say and ignore everything that you were just saying. Like, I would ignore it all.
One of my twin boys, my twins are 10 years old. Yeah. One of them has some interesting characteristics, and the more you challenge him rationally, and if he inside he knows he's wrong, but he not in his conscious mind, in some kind of subconsciousness, he knows he's wrong. He gets angrier and angrier, and like fights back in a way, and that's the way his brain reacts to being challenged. So certain people who are challenged will that backfire effect will push back much harder, and you know, rather than just hang on, let's just sit back, let's take this all in and actually take a couple of days to cogitate on this, and I'll come back to you.
Wow. You mentioned extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to read it, or do you mind if I read it? The claim, what you do is absolutely fascinating on page 40. When you take it one little step at a time, you don't just throw out there extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, because Christians even make videos, apologetic videos on the internet, trying to literally say that's not true. They'll say that's not necessary. That's not true. And you use just an ordinary example. Do you want me to read those examples?
You can go for it. Yeah, I was gonna just do number 1 and number 6, but you can go for it.
I'd like to go from claim 1 to claim 6 and show people how a normal, like, you wouldn't do anything different. Yeah, it's only when you get a Christian to look at this book and this particular religion do they do something absolutely outside of the reality of normal common sense when it comes to this.
100%.
So this brings me, I'm going to read your words. I'm going to vicariously have you live through me here for a moment.
I'll move my lips.
Okay, ready? This brings me on to certain maxim that was popularized by Carl Sagan. That maxim already existed in some form or other since philosophizing of David Hume. The Scottish Enlightenment philosopher Sagan, the late popular scientist and science popularizer, claimed extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is a self-evidentially true maxim, even though many theists seek to deny its power, and that's a fact. I denied this. I know for a fact. You're lying to yourself. I'm talking to you if you think this is not true. I'm going to be blunt and bold. I'm letting you know. I was talking to me, time traveling 9 years ago. Derek, open your eyes. This is because they misunderstand its best application. This claim is a statement that is most aptly applied to secondary or tertiary evidence. Let me exemplify what I mean by way of 5 claims and how most people would assess them, as I used in my nativity book, which is the other book. They really need to get the other one too, to go into the birth of Jesus and how it is not historically accurate at all. Claim 1, and follow me along with this, everyone who's watching this. Claim 1, I'm saying to you, right? I have a dog. And you'd say, well, nothing more than verbal testimony is needed. You believe me. I have a dog, and I literally have a Chihuahua. You believe me, don't you? I'm not lying.
Yeah, I do. I
have a dog.
I would have no reason to disbelieve.
Do I need to go get him to prove it?
No, verbal testimony is fine.
I could make him bark, though. I could have the kids bring him in. I could prove it to you if I needed to, but you don't need it. Claim 2, I have a dog which is in the bath. as above, with one eyebrow raised. Oh, your dog's in the bath? Oh, you must be washing your dog. Oh, maybe that is true. Claim 3, I have a dog in the bath wearing a dress. I would probably need a photo of this to believe you, you might think. Claim 4, I have a dress-wearing dog in the bath with a skunk wearing a scuba outfit. Now you say, I would need some video evidence at least, okay? Claim 5, I have the above in the bath, but the bath water is boiling and the animals are happy. I would need video and independent attestation that the video was not doctored, agreeing that this is what appeared to be happening. And you might need more than that, by the way. Just saying that that's at least what you would need. Claim 6, all of the above, but the dog has a fire-breathing dragon on its shoulder and the skunk is dancing with a live unicorn. Well, I'll be damned, you say. I'll need a video plus a video of the video plus independent attestation from multiple recognizable, reliable sources and assessment and evaluation by technological experts and biological experts plus a psychological evaluation of the claimant and so on. And you're right about the so on. You would need more to really be definitive.
I would probably say in order to justify that as a claim, to justify believing that as a claim, you would probably need to see it yourself.
Right. At the very least.
Which is to say, essentially, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I mean, it's obvious. It's obvious. As you say, Christians deny this, but you just can't get around it because it's what we do every day. The more ridiculous, like you go and have lunch at your place of work with your colleagues, right? And your mate goes to you, oh, I bought a car last week. And you go, okay, yeah. And you talk about the car and blah, blah, blah. But if your mate says, oh, I base jumped off Mount Everest 2 weeks ago and I did it with my arms tied by my back, you'd be like, no, you didn't. No, you didn't. Because like, that's ridiculous. Or if you did, you've got to show me because I'm really dubious of that. So, it's what we do all the time. You just can't argue that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
If I made the next paragraph that is important for those who might be going like this guy right here, this is such bad scholarship, Todd. I'm afraid I might think you're a Christian just because you put that. I'm sorry. Now, I may not even need a picture evidence for that. I may not need, but I have the evidence I need right here to say you're most likely a Christian. I could be wrong, but it sounds like it. All right. Naturalistically, you say, possible claims. The claim that I climbed Mount Everest without using my right arm and with only one eye is something that is physically possible, but ultimately very unlikely. As a result, people would naturally demand more evidence than me merely asserting this in a casual conversation. The more improbable my claim, the more incredible, the higher the demands for evidence. This reality is just intuitive. I love the way you're really well written, by the way. I really enjoy it because I just track with you 100%. It's just intuitive, common sense.
Yeah.
If we then make a claim that is about as unlikely as can possibly be, dead people resurrecting, for example, you say that a man God dies and is resurrected or performs any of his miracles, then these claims are of events that defy the laws of nature as we know them. This is almost by definition the most improbable set of claims. As a result, they should demand the highest level of evidence, especially when not witnessed firsthand. The standard of evidence, and then you're going into prior probability. I get excited because this is the best foundation before we even open the Bible and say, okay, look at what Paul says here. Look at what this, we're going to get there. But why we need to be cautious.
So that maxim is essentially a layman's understanding of Bayesian analysis or Bayes' theorem, right? So Bayes' theorem is a way, and Richard Carrier is big on this, is a way of assessing competing hypotheses for explaining data, right? Mm-hmm. So let me exemplify. So I look out there and the bush is moving. The bush in my garden is moving, right? Right. So I have two hypotheses. One, it's a tiger. Two, it's the wind, right?
Right.
So what do I do in order to assess those two hypotheses against each other? Well, first of all, I have my background knowledge, which is how I understand that the world works. Aside from this claim, aside from the evidence, aside from anything, I know, for example, I know that tigers don't exist in the wild in Britain, right? So that's one part of my background knowledge. Blah, 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 blah. So then I have something called, so that's all done and dusted. That's your background knowledge, how the world works. Then I might look at something called prior probability, which is to say that not looking at the evidence here, but what are the chances of a tiger being seen in the wild in Britain? What are all the previous claims that have happened about this? Have they been true? You can liken this to betting on a horse. So a horse has lost 1,000 races in a row. What's the chance it's going to win the next race? Right. Well, actually, the probability is probably going to be fairly low because its form is blah 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 blah. So therefore, should we bet on it winning the next race? Probably not. Right. So if all previous claims about tigers have broadly been false in Britain, there have been no tigers in the wild. Right. Then it means that the claim that what's making my bush move is a tiger has very low prior probability. So in order for the claim it's a tiger to be true, that low prior probability needs to be overcome with very, very good evidence. So I say, okay, it's an improbable claim. To overcome this, we need a high posterior probability. So we need really good quality evidence. This is what Bayesian theory does. And it plugs all these numbers in, and you apply numbers to all these different things. And then you can look at wind versus tiger and see what's the most probable explanation, right? So if my evidence is the bush is moving, I can see the bush moving, then my belief that it's a tiger is actually not very rational. That it's the wind, especially if I can see it's windy, is far more rational. So my evidence, it's windy, tigers don't exist in the wild in Britain, my background knowledge about how things work, blah, blah, blah. I'm much more rational in believing that it's the wind, right?
Right.
But that can change. So if I start getting new data in, that's like, I saw something orange and black and white moving there, and actually I've just found out that a tiger has escaped from a circus just down the road here, and 4 of my neighbors have phoned me to say, we think we've seen a tiger in the neighborhood. Now, this evidence is shifting the probability of the hypothesis being true.
Right.
Because I'm getting more and more quality evidence to support that hypothesis. Does this all make sense?
Oh, 100%. And I'm glad someone like you's taken a dummy like me through a crash course of Bayesian theory. Just obviously, I wouldn't know how to punch these numbers in.
Yeah,
in a calculator,
it all gets controversial when you punch numbers in, because that's where. So what it gets interesting because of things like confirmation bias, which is to say that I look at this evidence and I ascribe that a value of, say, 90 out of 100. I'm being arbitrary here.
Right.
And you look at that same bit of evidence and you only ascribe it as 34 out of 100. So what's that? Why is that going on? So this is where people can disagree on sort of Bayesian analysis, because it's disagreeing on what numbers you're actually putting in. But the principle is pretty self-evidently true, right? As far as I'm concerned.
So if we took it from the circus and the tiger and we applied this to, we know that people had apotheosis, okay? Even Julius Caesar, before the time of Christ, is already known to have supposedly ascended, right? There's these ascension narratives, these death, resurrection of pagan gods, etc. Well, there's prior probability that people believed in things like this already.
Yeah.
And do you think those are true?
No.
So Christians will outright deny those.
Yeah. The important part of that, Derek, is that Christians will agree that all the other claims are false.
Right.
So actually, Christians should agree that the prior probability of Jesus A, being divine, being a God figure, and B, dying and resurrecting and ascending and doing these miracles and whatever you want to throw into this whole bag here, the Christians should agree that the truth claim has a very low prior probability, right? And we should all agree with that. So therefore, it comes down to, how do we balance the low prior probabilities? We need really high posterior probability. We need really good evidence. So the skeptic and the Christian then look at Paul and the Gospels and say, is this really good evidence? Is this extraordinarily good evidence to overcome the extraordinarily low prior probabilities? The skeptic says no. The Christian, because they're so wrapped up in it, there's a lot of psychology involved and confirmation bias. They look at the Gospels and they will them to be really good level of evidence, but they just aren't.
I don't feel like we've literally been on this show for an hour and 4 minutes. That's how good this is, by the way. I'm really enjoying this. Okay.
Thanks. I'm loving it.
I know, because I was sucked into this. So I'm like going to totally use myself as a punching bag. And I hope everyone else tries, those people who are maybe trying to hear out a skeptic, but they're like, but I'm worried about hell, or I'm concerned about these other doctrines and stuff. We'll take the time to maybe chew on this over time. And just like beef jerky, if it's really good beef jerky, it's going to take a while to soften, but after a while, you can finally swallow it. You talk about, when we did the notes here, you put in there as one of the aims, you say, if untrue, then what might have taken place? What hypothesis can better explain the data? And then we talk about this. How is the quality of the Gospels, the reliable source? Are they reliable sources of information? That's a whole nother issue that we have. We were talking about this lion and bushes and all that, but now we were talking about the claims of the dog in the bathtub, and then all the way to a circus dragon and this, that, or whatever with fire breathing.
Yeah.
Notice I just combined circus and dragon all automatically. Right. Just pointing out, you got a guy walking on water, all of these extraordinary claims, the evidence that we have of the Gospels, there's problems there even when we start diving into this stuff.
So let's forget all of Jesus's life and all the miracles he supposedly did. I mean, you could add this on to your whole analysis, but let's just truncate Jesus's life to the death and resurrection, right? So let's remind the audience what happens, because we need to say, I need to establish, if I'm establishing my case, I need to firstly establish that the claims are extraordinary, before then establishing that in order to overcome a very low probability for that being true, we need really good evidence, right? So let's first talk about the claims. So if you don't mind, I'm going to rush through the claims for those people who can't remember their resurrection story.
Okay.
Now, it's worth remembering this. All the claims I'm just about to list happen in 1, 2, or 3 Gospels, or if they do happen in all 4 Gospels, then they happen in a different way, right? So some of these claims only happen in one Gospel and not the others. Why is that? That's weird. All of them have some kind of contradictory element to them when you compare the Gospels. As Bart Ehrman says, you should not read Gospel, 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 right? Because otherwise you don't realize that you've read a bunch of contradictions, because you've forgotten this Gospel by the time you got there, at least the finer details, and there, and you might not realize that the 4th Gospel actually disagrees with the 1st Gospel in this part and that part. What you need to do is place them next to each other so that you read each verse chronologically, each event chronologically in order across the Gospels to see whether they contradict. Okay, so that's a principle you need to have. So Jesus was God in human form. That was a kind of theological claim, possibly, arguably, only in John. So Jesus went to Jerusalem and he had a Last Supper with his disciples before going out to the Garden of Gethsemane and praying to himself. He was betrayed and arrested for the blasphemy of claiming to be divine. After being arrested, Jesus was condemned by religious leaders. He went on trial before Pilate. He was sent to Herod and then returned to Pilate, where he was sentenced to death. He was led away to Calvary. He was crucified. Whilst on the cross, the soldiers cast lots for his clothes. He was scourged and whipped, and he's got those bloody clothes, and then he walked across down, and then somehow they cast lots for those clothes. They really want them. They're like, that's a nice bloody top. I like that. So whilst on the cross, he was mocked and insulted. Another criminal on the cross rebuked him. Jesus spoke to Mary and John from the cross. There was an earthquake. Tombs were opened, and dead saints paraded around Jerusalem. So these are zombies, literally zombies parading around Jerusalem that Matthew says everybody saw, right? The veil of the temple was torn. The temple has this big, thick, Temple of Jerusalem, incredibly sacred, has this big, thick piece of material, and that was apparently rent. There was darkness for 3 hours. Soldiers pierced his side to hasten his death. His death and suffering contributed to a greater good and atoned somehow for all of humanity's sins that God needed for some reason to have the books balanced, or some other similar theory that Christians themselves can't quite agree on. Jesus' body is taken and buried by a Sanhedrin member, a Jewish council member, Joseph of Arimathea. Pilate granted permission for guards to be placed at the tomb. And then after that, 3 days later, or it depends which gospel you read, bit Bart Ehrman there, it depends which gospel you read. That's my best American accent. Some people arguable as to who and exactly when. go to the tomb. No angels, or one angel or two angels are there, and a stone is rolled away. Jesus is resurrected. That is a fully fledged human being. It comes back to life. He goes around appearing to many people in the local area as a resurrected human, and in Galilee or Jerusalem, depends, which gospel you believe, and over a 40-day period, including to more than 500 people at one time. He then ascends into heaven by rising into the clouds, and angels question why the disciples are staring into the skies if there's something amazing to see. That's the story, right? Now, within that, we have some extraordinary claims. We've got a divine figure as in human form. We've got dying and coming back to life. We've got appearing to a shed load of people. We've got an earthquake. We've got darkness for 3 hours. We've got zombies parading around Jerusalem. We've got the temple veil being rent. And you've got Jesus walking through walls and all sorts of things in his appearance narratives. These are, would you agree that these are extraordinary claims?
100%. 100%.
So hopefully by just going through that, we can establish that these are extraordinary claims.
In fact, if I could say, just to say, I want to add to that icing on the cake. As a Christian, I didn't know all of the skeptics and what they added to the whole extraordinary claims, and they go, requires extraordinary evidence. I didn't get into all that. The reason I believed it is because the story was so amazing and it somehow included me into the narrative. Make sure you paint this so it's for me. Oh, and he cares so much about you. It included me, that the fact he could walk through walls and all of that stuff made me want to believe it even more. And I was okay with saying this was absolutely extraordinary. That's why it was miraculous. I mean, so I had no problem doing that, but I didn't realize the rationale behind it requires better data than what we already have, because I didn't see any of the problems.
So here's a problem for your former self. Here's a problem for Todd, who commented earlier, if he is indeed a Christian. He might just be a naysayer. Fair enough. Yeah. But if he's a Christian, here's the problem. And this is where psychology is really, really important. And there's something called terror management theory. So this is about managing your mortality salience, your understanding of mortality. So when you go up to a young earth creationist and say, do you know what? Here's evidence that the earth the earth is more than 6,000 years old. Right? The young earth creationist, by taking on that evidence, you're not just discussing the age of the earth, okay? Because actually, if you're just looking at the age of the earth, absent of all other ideas in the world, the young earth creationist should go, fair enough, you've presented really good evidence, and actually I'm much more rational to believe your evidence. Mm-hmm. But the problem is, what you're doing is, by presenting that evidence to the young earth creationist, you are saying, if you take on my position here that the earth is more than 6,000 years old, your whole worldview starts falling apart.
Right.
And if that happens, you are not going to go to heaven. Literally, this is what's going on in the mind. It might be subconscious, but you are saying, but by challenging your idea of how old the earth is, I'm actually challenging your access to eternal life in heaven. And you can totally understand the Christians go, no, I'm pushing back on that, because that is literally the biggest carrot in human conception. And if you're challenging, and I believe the wrong thing, and God does exist, I'm then beaten with the biggest stick in human conception of hell. There's nothing that my mind can conceive that is worse than hell. And there's nothing better that my mind can conceive that is better than heaven. Right? There's literally the biggest carrot and stick. So when you are challenging a Christian on anything like the resurrection or the age of the earth or evolution, you're not just challenging them on those ideas, you are challenging them on their access to eternal life. And that is why they push back.
That's amazing.
They might not realize it.
No, that's a great point. I did a recent conversation with a guy named Canadian Catholic. People are like, horrible conversation. They thought
he's contacted me, actually.
Oh, has he?
I don't know whether to do it, but yeah.
I mean, I'd love to host you and him on the Bayesian stuff and show why, because he thinks Bayesian probability proves the Gospels and the story and the narrative of resurrection are true. And I literally brought your book up. He saw that David Fitzgerald wrote a foreword to it, and he said, horrible book, his scholarship. And I'm like, you haven't even read it. And he already. But the point is, he said he's not a presuppositionalist. He's an evidentialist. And he said it was his intellectual journey that led him to Christ, right? Supposedly. He's 21 years old, really young.
He's an atheist when he was 17, because everyone knows what they're doing when they're 17.
Yeah, he was supposedly like an atheist before this, supposedly. And I'm not trying to even go and discredit all that. The point is, in it, I found very presuppositional concepts, right? He goes, well, first, I said, why do you believe the resurrection is true? well, first you need to know there's a monotheistic single God. And if you at least can accept that there's a single God, he already jumped, right? And he didn't hide it. He literally did not even focus on the resurrection arguments and try to present that. He went right back because he knows that, like, if you just look at the text and you're dealing with that argument, you can't prove a resurrection. There's no way you're going to convince me just by looking at it. Kind of like flat earth. If I threw evidence the earth is old at not a flat earth, but a young earth creationist, throwing evidence to them, or flat earth, whatever you want to do, to say, because there's some people who are biblical minded or the cosmology of the ancient Near East, and they say it's flat because the Bible teaches this idea, whatever. And you present that, they're going to go to other places. All right. Do we at least believe in Jesus? Oh, okay. Or whatever. Like, let me show you why a God exists. He couldn't just show me, let me prove to you why the resurrection of Jesus exists. I got to give you 10 other things you need to accept and connect these dots then to get down to say, okay, now Jesus, now you know why it's true. No. And then there were times in our discussion where he clearly went right with, well, Jonah existed. And I said, is the story of Jonah true? And is this real? He said, well, the church, the Catholic Church, calls him a saint, so it must be true. And I'm like, what kind of evidence is this?
Yeah, you almost can't debate. I mean, I've said recently that I no longer debate young earth creationists, because when you are happy to have that as your basic grounds for rationality and that almost that presuppositionalism, then we can't, like, our evaluation of data is so wildly different that we can't have a conversation that's going to be meaningful. It's like Ken Ham and Bill Nye. So, you know, what will change your mind? And Bill Nye says evidence, and Ken Ham says, well, nothing's going to change my mind. It's just true type thing. It's paraphrasing, and you're like, well, what's the point in having this conversation?
Yeah.
So what there is something that's quite interesting that comes out of what you said. So I wrote a piece which is actually now in the book as a section. I don't know if you got to it yet, but it's the circularity of having faith in the New Testament. And actually, William Lane Craig took this on and did a podcast about it, and we had some disagreements over this. But here's the thing. So I look at Christians who then can use Bayesian analysis, and they say, well, you as a skeptic already say that supernaturalism a priori doesn't exist. There's no such thing, right? You're a naturalist. Mm-hmm. And actually, I would say, well, actually, no. I can say that I can leave the door open that supernaturalism could be a possibility. And a bit like the Catholic Church at Lourdes, right? So where they have all these miracle claims all the time, the Catholic Church just don't accept all the miracle claims. What they do is they say, actually, you need to get to a level of evidence that's this high for us to rubber stamp your miracle claim. I would just say that my bar is way, 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 way higher. But they are at least saying that miracle claims are improbable. So you can be a supernaturalist that looks at this resurrection claims and say, I still believe that the supernatural could happen. However, these claims are still massively improbable, and the evidence still doesn't justify the claims. So that's a side. But I see a circularity in belief. So I look at a Christian and say, why do you believe in the resurrection? And they say, well, because I have faith in the New Testament. Why do you have faith in the New Testament? Because I believe this and that. And part of that belief will be because I already accept the supernatural, right? Mm-hmm. And then you ask, why do you accept the supernatural? And they often have to revert back to because of Jesus, right? Because because I know it's true, because Jesus resurrected from human form into a resurrected form. Jesus resurrected from the dead. So that's how I know the supernatural is true. And then you say, but hang on, you plug that into your background knowledge to get the conclusion that supernaturalism is true. You are starting with supernaturalism but it's actually a circle. So you're starting with supernaturalism, which actually is dependent upon your belief in the truth of the resurrection, and it just goes back. And there's just a really problematic circle that goes on. And I think that's a huge problem.
Yeah, that's well put. I used to do that, and I had no problem with doing that, because at the end of the day, if I was going to be honest with myself, it was the experience that I felt when this social group I was a part of at church, in a middle school Christian academy church, when they gave this sermon and they touched that tone with me, they hit that spot, that emotional place. And when I went down with this whole other guy holding his hand on my back, brother, it's going to be okay. We're together. It was a social, psychological. I mean, it was the biggest, what do you call that? A placebo that really I felt, right? I mean, and I experienced it, and then I attached that to the book the guy who gave me the placebo effect to, and therefore that what he said was true. So when it really boils down to it, if I was actually able to consciously and not subconsciously hide this, it came down to, why did I feel that way then when that message hit me? Because if you've seen Darren Brown, the magician, he did a show where he converts an atheist.
Yeah.
And he literally shows you how he fabricates a conversion and then has to explain to her that he made it all up. She's in absolute tears, crying, thinking this is God. And for real, he psychologically got her. Then he has to say, by the way, just so you know, I did all of that. It didn't require a God. It doesn't mean that I didn't tap into real things that you really experience that are true to you, that you have, right, that are already there. But I fabricated it because I knew what I was doing. That's all it was for me.
It goes back to what we were saying right at the beginning, which is a huge component of belief is the psychology of belief. So I think psychology of religion is massively interesting. And if you are in the business of deconverting people or involved in arguments with theists as an atheist to say, look, you should believe my side of the story, then you need to understand not what they believe, but why they believe what they do. Because if you don't understand why they believe, then you can't either replace that functionality with something else, or wash away that functionality by showing that functionality is somehow not good or not appropriate or whatever. So if you don't understand the psychology of belief, you're not going to win arguments on natural theology and you know, unpicking the Bible. Unfortunately, because it's really good fun, but actually it's all about psychology, isn't it? I think. Yeah.
Someone said that was terrible by the magician. I like, if we were to say the good or the bad here, because, you know, sometimes the lesser evil is what we have to pick. Some things are just gray. I think that it was necessary that Darren Brown did something like that on that show so that more people could actually see. I mean, imagine, how would you actually give evidence to show that you can create this religious experience, right? And if you haven't seen it, it is a must watch, because he doesn't just trick this girl into having this. He also tricks the audience, and he does these things like, I'm going to open this mint vial. Raise your hand when you smell it. And then he says there's some sound waves in the background. Come to find out, the mint vial only had water in it, and there was no sound waves, and it's all this BS. And people were sitting there raising their hand like they smelt it, they experienced it. It's all psychological, like you said. Let me read something else from your book, if you don't mind. I love going back to your writing, because you do so well in this. It is in the description. Let me pop this up too, because some people were like, where do I go to? Oh, did I pop it up? Where is it at? Hold on. Add to stream. Boom. There we go. All right. So his book is this one right here with the question mark on Amazon. In the description, you can go to MythVision recommended books. The Resurrection, a critical examination of the Easter story. It is a must get. Well written. He also has the nativity, just as critical. So you absolutely want to check those out. All right, reading something from page 42. And I put pin marks and stuff in here, you know, when I wanted to bring something up. You say, we do this kind of reasoning all the time, including like when you are working out, whether to cross the road. Given what you know about traffic and the present observations at hand, it helps you conclude it will be safe to cross the road now, given the data. If there is a rustling in a bush, we already did this because you go into the lion, right? To overcome this tiny prior probability at hand of a God figure being resurrected after dying and of dead saints rising and parading around a city, one must have very high consequence. Consequence. Sorry. Did I say
consequence?
That right?
So yeah, consequence as in consequent probability, which means evidence.
The evidence must be stunningly good. This of the examples given above in claims 5 and 6 about the dog in the bath. A dying and rising God and resurrection of many beings supposedly witnessed by many is mind-boggling as a claim, and the evidence needs to be exceptionally good to overcome this. To make the truth of this claim the most probable interpretation of the data, Christians are happy to dismiss other similar religious claims from rival religions, and yet it seems their evidence threshold is lowered greatly to allow a supposedly rational acceptance and belief in these resurrection claims. Not only do we not have video evidence of the resurrection claims, but we have no independent attestation. One would expect this given that supposedly 500 plus people at one time, according to one source, witnessed a risen God, and yet there is absolute silence, where one would expect to have evidence and voice. If we do not have it, then this absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Sometimes Christians claim that this does not follow, that there is usually the idea and claim that because you don't have some evidence for something happening, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. But as you will see here, this is not always the case. I will return to this point in chapter 8, and we're going to get to that at some point.
Absence of evidence is evidence of absence when you would expect there to be evidence. For example, and this is really important because Christians do challenge this. So Paul, for example, says very little about anything about Jesus that's particularly useful in terms of details and data and historical foundation, right? And so we say, well, there's a silence in Paul. What does that tell us? It looks like it was all kind of made up from Mark onwards and embellished. And the Christians say, no, it's rubbish. Just because there wasn't evidence, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. So, for example, I might claim that next door was burgled, but then you look at the house and doesn't look burgled at all. So just because there's no evidence for it doesn't mean that it wasn't actually burgled. They jimmied open the window and they got in without blah, blah, blah. But I should be able to find out the data about that to find out that it was actually burgled, right? I can do the verification of that claim. Problem with the history is you can't really readily do that. Mm-hmm. Now, the big problem, though, is where you would absolutely expect evidence, and there is none. This is actually evidence that the claim is false. So, for example, Derek, yesterday in your hometown, there was an earthquake 7.5 on a Richter scale, right? And you go, okay, that's an interesting claim. So what you do is you look out the window, you go around your town, there are no buildings showing any signs of damage. Everything is intact. There's nothing on the news, and there's no news reports talking about this. You speak to all your neighbors and all your friends in the area. Nope, I didn't feel anything. You didn't feel anything. So therefore, because there is no evidence where you would expect it, so such a big claim like there's an earthquake 7.5 on a Richter scale in your town, the fact that there is no evidence for that claim is actually evidence against my claim being true. Now, does that make sense?
Yeah. Because you're making an if I were asking you to prove a negative, that's not possible. But since I'm making an affirmation, and there is no evidence to back that other than my affirmation, which is the kind of the Bible. And then we're going to get into the nitpickies about this whole claim. Like you talked about the 500. Like, why didn't others within the 500 that were witnesses write accounts about this? Wouldn't you think they'd figure something out?
That. If you'd literally seen God, right, you would be like, well, let's shout about this. And so we'll talk about this with the guards who instead of this happened in the Exodus, right? The Egyptians have been like murdered. God through Moses has said X, Y, and Z, had all these crazy miracles happen. The Egyptian entire army gets destroyed, blah, blah, blah. This happens over all this time. And the Egyptians don't believe in God, right? They're like, not only is there no evidence, but actually they don't even change to believing in God. They're like, no, we're just going to carry on just believing in our pagan deities for literally the rest of history until like Judaism becomes a major thing 1,000 years later. And so what I call this, that's slightly different, but the fact that they didn't change their opinions, but I call this disconfirmation by silence. So it's like, you can't prove it didn't happen, but it adds towards a probability that it didn't happen. So when we talk about the dead saints parading around Jerusalem, when we talk about the temple veil being rent, when we talk about darkness for 3 hours, and when we talk about an earthquake, right? And this is particularly in Matthew, the fact that there is no other attestation to this in any recorded history makes those claims that we only see in the Gospels, so Matthew is the only one that has the zombies. I think he's the only one that's got the earthquake. What's the probability of that claim being false? Well, pretty high, because there's no other evidence where we would absolutely expect it.
And this is exactly why we have Christian apologists like, what is his name? He got fired from an evangelical college.
I talk about this in the book. So Mike Licona he's duty bound to conclude. So you can't. I talk about this hyperliteralism. This is the ramifications of hyperliteralism, which is you work for an institution, and when you say, actually, I've got a really interesting interpretation of this. It might be somewhat allegorical and symbolic. No, you can't have that. Well, how is this free and open like analysis and scholastics. You know, how is this? You are telling me what I have to believe, and I have to do a work that fits in line with this exact conclusion. This is like the opposite to intellectual rigor.
Yeah. Do you want to eat or not? Okay. Well, if you want to eat, you better tote the line. If you don't want to eat, then bye. We're not paying you because you're now changing the message. I mean, you know, I have to say, when I hear you bring this up in the book, it makes me want to re-examine it and go, this is a claim. I think he went into the allegory. I think that he went into the allegory because he saw historically the problem with this claim and how ridiculous it is.
So it gets even better than that. So when you start understanding what the authors are doing in the Gospels and in the Old Testament particularly, when you understand the anthropological context within which they're set, like I said earlier, when you understand the allusions that they're trying to make, right, then it becomes so much richer. Like the Bible becomes a brilliant book.
Right.
Like when you're secular reading it and go, he's making an allusion to that, and that's a connection to that. I like what he's done. This didn't happen. But he's selling this in a way, he's telling us something by saying the blah, 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 blah. So someone told me the other day, and I haven't got this in the book.
Okay.
So the next edition will include this. And I haven't properly researched it. So bear with me. But someone told me, and I'm really annoyed I didn't know this, that it was possibly Ezekiel died and there was an earthquake and darkness at his death. Right. And if that's the case, and I need to look into this, so, you know, all the caveats, if that's the case, and Matthew, so when you're talking about writing and when you're talking about communicating, there are three aspects to writing and communicating, right? It's audience, purpose, and form. Your form is what you write and your content. And that is defined by who you're writing for, your audience, and what your objective is. And those two things will define entirely what you write. So the audience in Matthew are Jews. The objective is to convince them to believe what I believe, that Jesus is the Messiah. So because they're Jews and because that's my objective, I am going to write things that tick all the boxes for Jews and that show Jesus in a really fantastic Jewish light, right? So then, which we understand. So Matthew does this. He does this in the Nativity. He does this right throughout his gospel, which is everything Jesus does is he's the new Moses. He's Old Testament, Old Testament, Old Testament, and I'm going to throw it at Jesus, and all this stuff sticks to Jesus in an Old Testament layer. But if also the earthquake and the darkness is Matthew using what happened at Ezekiel's death, because Ezekiel's a really important Old Testament figure, and then just there's this thing called midrash and pesha, where you are like reinterpreting, retelling stories in a current way for your audience. This makes perfect sense. And this is where, as a secular, I'm like, this is brilliant. I love what you're doing here. You're taking these ideas, you've got your audience, and you're going with this. You're trying to evangelize. Your job is evangelizing, right? Is persuasion. You're not writing history. This is theology, not history. And you are selling it to your audience in this particular manner, in a manner that's very different from Luke, because he has a different audience.
I think that's fascinating. And if he's using this Pesher mimetic connection here, which I definitely don't discount that. I mean, it's obvious he's the new Moses, all this, taking it from an already existing narrative. So when people talk about, is the New Testament fulfilled in the Old Testament prophecies? It's like, dude, we could produce a writing right now and do this to the New Testament.
Yeah.
Are you going to say this is God inspired because we now have intellectually well-written, poetic authors who know how to use New Testament scripture and apply it to a new book and say, well, the prophecies...
Does it make our new claims true? No.
Exactly. It's very simple. I'm not going to say simple to produce. You have to be obviously educated in a way that could do this.
It's
They're
very
smart
They
guys.
do an amazing job.
Right. I'm not trying to downplay it. I'm just saying there are better explanations than this is literally true. Yes. And if he's hijacking at the death, there's this earthquake and this and that. He's using it theologically and literarily. Like, this is no wonder scholars are going, we can't pinpoint this this eclipse you guys are talking about. We can't pinpoint this thing. And if it was, and I'm granting historically that something happened around the death of Ezekiel, let's say this guy in the Old Testament died, and now you just ripped it out of its context and applied it, you shot Jesus in the foot. Because now we can go back and see, oh, well, eclipses didn't actually happen that day, or there wasn't an eclipse in that time, or whatever you want to say. I mean,
it's that silence. Yeah.
It's silence. So real quick, I just want to plug my friend, Dr. Kip Davis, Hi, everyone. I'm absolutely jacked about McDowell documentary premiere tomorrow. I hope everyone checks it out. We are definitely going live tomorrow at 4 p.m. here on MythVision as a post-live show discussing the documentary that Kip Davies has produced that will go and be premiered tomorrow. Don't miss it. Subscribe to his channel. McDowell's testimony has been mythologized just like Jesus. I mean, maybe not to the extreme of Jesus, but you want to watch the documentary. Trust me. Dr. Kip does a fantastic job. I'll be there, and then we'll be doing the live after that. So I just want to give that short plug. But would you like to add anything in particular to that?
Yeah, so I suppose it's now time to look at the sources, right? So there are extraordinary claims. What are our sources? Paul, to start with, and then the Gospels. So let's have a look at Paul, right? So Paul is the earliest source of Jesus and the earliest source of the resurrection claims, okay? Here is what Paul says about the resurrection, okay? For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. So interesting that he had a vision. This is well after Jesus ascended to heaven, obviously. You know, this is many years later, and he has a vision of Jesus, and he's including that in the appearances. So is that to say all the appearances could have been hallucinations? And we can talk about the difference between hallucination and visions later. But the idea is that that's interesting. He's also saying according to the scriptures, according to scriptures. So he's receiving his data about Jesus from the scriptures, and also from what people have told me, but none of it's firsthand. But what do we not have? What do we not have is he says nothing about the empty tomb. He says nothing about the burial. He says nothing about the resurrection apart from very general terms. And there is a massive absence of evidence where we should expect it, right? So he is writing to the Corinthians here to convince them of certain aspects of the resurrection, right? We know this from the first letter to the Corinthians, second letter, blah, blah, blah. This would be the perfect time to throw in, and I know this because this person told me, and I know this because there was an empty tomb, and I know there's an empty tomb because of blah, 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 and I know this happened because Thingy was by the cross when that happened, and this happened there. He does none of that. That's interesting.
Yes. Well, one of the things I've heard, obviously his gospel, he says he received from no one. Clearly, Galatians says this. In 1 Corinthians 15, I do want to mention in verse 4, he does say that he was buried and that he was raised, but he doesn't say a tomb. He doesn't say.
No, exactly.
So
yeah.
What do we mean by buried? And Dr. Price, of course, has this position. He thinks this is a Credal formulation that is much later, or potentially was developed over time. And maybe there's already, this is like the first developments of like mythologizing him into, I don't know.
Yeah, so I talk about exactly that, and I use Bart Ehrman, who also talks about this pre-existing Credal formula that exists, and I think that's absolutely on the money. But the broader point to make here is that this, for me, is evidence that the empty tomb idea didn't exist with Paul. So it didn't, and we'll talk about this in much more detail later because it fits in with loads of other stuff. But basically, Paul didn't know about an empty tomb. Mark created the empty tomb, or people around Mark's time, and Mark wrote it down. But essentially, Mark created the empty tomb thesis. Matthew comes along later and has the empty tomb thesis, but he has a Jewish counter argument that the Christians could have stolen the body. So Matthew then inserts some guards at the tomb, right, which is clearly a counter argument. We also know that that Justin Martyr also wrote about this, saying that there were Jews that were claiming that Christians stole the body. So then, but then Luke and John come later. They get rid of Matthew's guards because I possibly don't know for what reason, but probably because they see it for what it really was, which was just a counter argument. So, but if the Jews had been accusing people of stealing the body straight away, and if Paul knew about the empty tomb, so therefore the Jews would have known about the empty tomb and would have been creating this counter argument, then Mark would have been giving us the guards at the tomb. But
Right.
Mark doesn't give us the guards of the tomb, which then shows that he was the one that created the empty tomb, or at least it is evidence towards believing that he created the empty tomb events. And Matthew is then dealing with the counter arguments against that. Now, what also leads us to conclude that Paul didn't know about the empty tomb is, and Richard Carey's big on this, and I write a whole chapter, you won't come to this yet in the book, there's a whole chapter on a two-body theory of resurrection. So I think, and I agree with Carey completely here, that Paul didn't think that Jesus resurrected bodily. He thinks Jesus had a spiritual resurrection and transformed his body into a spiritual body and then resurrected, but left the real body there, right?
James D. Tabor also agrees with you and Carrier on this. Yes.
So then why is it that the empty tomb becomes a thing? Now, these are the synoptics and later John particularly saying, we disagree with Paul. His theology is wrong. It's kind of in line with Gnostic theology, although Gnostic isn't like a movement like people used to think it was. It's kind of disparate people believing these different things. But one of the beliefs was this kind of spiritual resurrection idea. Mm-hmm. So the Mark then says, no, Paul, I disagree. And I'm going to show I disagree by having a tomb where the body disappears because Jesus is getting up and leaving. And then this culminates in embellishment after embellishment until John comes along and says, Thomas pokes Jesus, Jesus eats broiled fish, and you have this idea that why would he be saying these things? It's always, you should always ask, why does this author include this? Not, oh, that's interesting. Why does the author include the fact that they're casting lots for the clothes? Because it's in Psalm 22. Okay, now I understand, right? Why does John include Thomas poking and eating broiled fish? Because he is saying to his audience, Jesus was a body and resurrected bodily, and we are in effect disagreeing with the theology that came out of Paul.
There is this fascinating place that I would like to point out. Let me see, Matthew 27, I believe it is. And just a quick little note that I heard in James D. Tabor's book, and I thought to myself, this is so interesting. They go out, where is this at? Let's see. They're supposed to meet him in Galilee, which is different. I think it's in Matthew that they go to Galilee. Okay, they took him. Okay, so this is the crucifixion in 27. Bear with me 1 second. Let me go back to 28.
I mean, you've got this, the prevailing idea is that all the Gospels are different because they all have different audiences and they all have slightly different objectives. It goes back to audience, objective, form, right? So why do they have contradictions? Because they all have the marginally different aspect of an audience and an objective. And once you understand that, you understand why Luke might be saying this and Matthew might be saying that. So why in the Nativity is Luke appealing to why does he have shepherds and does have no mention of rich, wise people coming from the East? Because he's a Hellenized sort of writer appealing to the bucolic kind of humble farmer type. That he's saying Jesus appeals to the humble, whereas Matthew is more thinking about the Jews and thinking about we're trumping the Eastern religions, and I'm appealing to the more rich and prominent, so on and so forth.
All right, I'm showing you this here. I got to screen share this real quick, if you don't mind. I want everyone who's watching to please check out his book. I'm telling you, it is amazing. Pulling up this screenshot that I just took of Matthew, but I figure if someone doesn't have their Bible out, why don't I just go ahead and show them? I did it in the NET, New English Translation.
I didn't want to NASB, but yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I don't want anyone saying you use the devil's Bible by going to NIV, Right. Here we are. I hope this is big enough. So here he says in chapter 28, so the 11 disciples went to Galilee to the mountain Jesus had designated. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. All right, I brought this up before. How the hell are you going to doubt if the presence of the resurrected Jesus is in your face? Like it's really beyond me to think. And many of them worshiped. You look over at Joe and he's convinced, oh Lord. And the next guy's like, I don't know if that's really
This goes back to that Exodus thing about you've just had your entire country decimated, right? Literally the firstborn children and cattle and locusts and Nile blood, and your army's been destroyed, and there's been pillars of fire and all this kind of stuff, and all the Egyptians are like, yeah, no, I'm not sure that God Yahweh exists. Actually, I think I might just carry on believing in old, Set and Osiris. Thank you very much. But hang on, where have you been? Half of your country's dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly the same.
Oh man, there's so much we're going to get into the details he goes into in this book. I will try, because Richard Carrier gave such a positive review of your book on Amazon. I'm going to talk to him about potentially, when we're done with the series, having a episode where he joins us and we can dive into your book and have fun on the resurrection and the apologetics and stuff that he's dealt with.
I work quite closely with him in particular the burial aspect and the understanding of Jewish law. So Carrier's got a phenomenal encyclopedic knowledge of that, well, of the whole resurrection actually, but particularly in this sort of death and burial area. And he was a really good.
You got to get this, everybody. This is the book that I'm reading. I say that because right now, this is episode 1. We're doing a series, deep dive. If you send someone the series that is willing to consider evidence and consider what skeptics think and why we don't accept the resurrection is true, from one who absolutely believed. I've got testimonies on YouTube of me at churches sharing my testimony as a believer. I had a whole YouTube channel devoted to the idea of the sovereignty of God and his salvific power in my life and blah, 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 the whole nine. Like, I'm over here as a skeptic and I'm telling you, read the book. Get the book now, because right now we're only at like page 67, right? The first. And I know you're going to talk about one thing I'd like to hear is the David Koresh.
I mean, I don't know how much time we've got left, but I'll talk about. So that's Paul. So my point about Paul was that he's the earliest source, and he tells us virtually nothing that's of use, that's of historic use, particularly. He makes a couple of bare assertions, like Jesus is buried and is resurrected. Right, there you go. That's
but what is he buried? Like, is that like a regular grave?
Who was there? Yeah, who was there? What happened? Was there an empty tomb? All this. So then you say, okay, now let's look at the Gospels, because remember what we're looking at is extraordinary evidence requires extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Is this extraordinary evidence? Paul, no, it's not extraordinary evidence. He says, I got most of my knowledge from scriptures and from personal revelations, and he's then not giving us any detail. So this is not good evidence. So now let's look at Mark. Mark is writing. Now, you will have people who disagree with what I'm going to say, right? People will disagree on what the chronology of the Gospels were, but I will lay out what I think is broadly the case, which is Mark is writing first, sometime after 70 CE and the destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew writes next. Luke writes after that, because I think if you've had Steve Mason on, have you, talking about stuff? I think Luke is accessing a bit of Josephus. So I think actually now I've changed my mind to think Luke is later than Matthew, and John is right out, right? Okay, so you got your synoptics and then you got John, and that's a chronology. And Matthew's probably 85 onwards, Luke later than that, and John in the hundreds. Okay, broadly speaking, we can argue about the finer details there, but that's your chronology. The important thing is they are all codependent. That's not, Christians will tell you have 4 independent sources for the resurrection account. No, you don't. You have one framework of sources, and they all depend on Mark and possibly Q, if you agree with Q existing. People like Mark Goodacre recently putting a pretty good case across that Q doesn't exist. So this idea of a source that's been lost, that they label Q because of a particular German word. So either Mark or Mark and Q form the basis of all the Gospels, and they are all embellishing Mark as they go further on to deliver their own theological agenda. So what do we know about the Gospel writers? None of them are eyewitnesses. The provenance and dates of the writing is unknown. We don't know where and when they're written. We can guess, have educated guesses. They were written ex post facto. What does that mean? Well, it means that these guys believed Jesus was the Messiah first, and then went and wrote about his messianicness and his life, right? So they're already committed believers. They are agenda driven, which means they are biased. They are evangelizers. Luke the evangelist. These guys, their raison d'etre is to convince their audience to believe what they believe, right?
Yep.
They are not writing history. They are not using known historical methodology, historiographical methodology. We know that contemporaneous historians at the time, Thucydides, Polybius, Arrian, they were at least discussing their sources. They were even saying that Thucydides was quite open about the use of speech. Now, here's a big problem I had. The Bible is littered with speech. Old Testament, New Testament, speech all the way through it. Who was there noting down what Jesus said with Pilate in private? Who was there pressing the button on a dictaphone? All right, hang on, Jesus.
Of Gethsemane. Yeah.
Just wait there, wait there. I missed that last bit. I just go over it again. I just need to chisel it out of stone a bit quicker, or whatever. Do you know what? It's ridiculous. Yeah. So anytime you've got speech in a supposedly historical book, alarm bells should be going. Alarm bells should be going off. That speech is not historical. So it's written in Greek. They're written in Greek and not Aramaic, which is Jesus' own language. That whole list of issues that I have should lead you to conclude that these are not good quality sources. And then you've got Mark even finishes he doesn't even have any ascension appearance narratives or the ascension. His finishes at Mark 16:9, isn't it? So after that, yeah. So as in 9 onwards is in most Bibles, it's in brackets, which is to say that we know this is an interpolation, a later addition to Mark. So that's got to tell you something. And then later on, though, those interpolations are embellished. Just very poor evidence, really poor evidence, which leads me to talk about this David Koresh kind of analogy. Is it okay to share that?
Yeah, and I want to let Mr. Monster know, I'm going to get your question here. If you guys have questions, we're going to wrap up after David Koresh. I'll take your super chat questions and ask Mr. Pierce here, and then remember part 1. I'll make sure you guys see the screen for the book too soon. So thank you for the super chats.
Absolutely. I just need to get to the right page. But yeah, so what would your opinion of all the Gospels being pretty low quality evidence? I mean, what were you thinking when you were a believing Christian?
Oh, no, I believed them hook, line, and sinker, that they were the actual historical what happened and they were true. And I would listen to guys like William Lane Craig and these other apologists that are out there that would try to make up some type of they only pointed out the details that they wanted to present. It wasn't they were purposely contradictions. It was just, to him, it was just important to point out there was one angel instead of 2, or there was only one woman instead of 3 or 4. Those weren't contradictions. So I always downplayed everything was able to be rationalized. Let me find a way to harmonize and say these are all separate accounts.
Yeah.
So it's all just 4 witnesses, not 1. But
yeah. Exactly. So I like to analogize this by saying, okay, imagine that me, Jonathan Pierce, I really dig David Koresh. Not now, actually in about 20 years' time, to make the analogy even more accurate. So in about 20 years' time, I am like, David Koresh is the Messiah. He is utterly cool, right? He is a divine being. But I believe this whilst in another country, right? Okay. And I believe he's the living Messiah, but I don't have telephone. I don't have the internet. I don't have a car or public transport to research these claims, and travel is too expensive, too lengthy, and actually too dangerous often. But after being converted to Koreshianism, coming to already claim that this guy is a Messiah, this is the ex post facto bit, I then write a history or account of this guy and his messiahship. So remember, I've never met him. There's no way of knowing, and it's unlikely given my geography, whether I have met any of his disciples and how I got my sources. And I even call myself an evangelist, one whose job it is to convince other people using persuasive techniques of the messiahship of Koresh. Do you think that this would be a reliable account of David Koresh? Should my account be trusted? And the answer should be no. Like, if that's what I'm writing, about David Koresh, and you are looking into the objective historical understanding of David Koresh, my account should be treated with a huge amount of doubt and skepticism. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, 100%. But I would, like I said, I never came to Christianity. I'm being honest. I didn't come to it because it was smart, that I knew it was actually true, that it was actually factual. And I think apologists, their job today isn't just defend, it's to try and present it as if it's intellectual and this is actually true. So their job is to now they're moving the goalpost. God is now outside space and time. God is in, like, beyond comprehension. And the goalpost always moves on and on and on, and they're sophisticating the whole religion. And it's really not the reason I became a Christian. And in fact, I very much doubt, if we took a poll, I would suspect the 2 billion, if there are that many Christians in the world today, they're not Christians because this is true in any factual historical manner at all. You might can count, I don't know, I don't want to put a number on it, but it's definitely not a significant number that this is. They might believe it's true, but not taking a critical inquiry like this. You wouldn't walk away. This is why a lot of Christians, I think, stop being Christians after they go to like secular colleges that take critical examinations of their own beliefs. And mind you, for the Christian who might be watching this all the way to this point, Islam's the same way. I had an ex-Muslim who came on and said it's so hard to find Muslim scholars for, first of all, there's not a lot of money in it. You're kind of committing suicide in a way by coming out against such a religious movement, because they don't take fondly to criticism. But also the ones who have their own faiths analyzed inside of secular colleges like Harvard and such don't walk out viewing Islam, the Quran, and all that the same. They can't even look at it the same, because now you've looked at it in a way you were never taught to look at it when you stood behind a pulpit hearing the guy going, "This is the truth. Don't you feel it? Don't you feel it?" And the Mormons have the same thing, and the Hindus and the Muslim. Everyone has the same, "Do you feel it?" And they attach it to, "Let me make this true." And in some way, they justify their claims of miracle.
And what's important to remember is, this is where John Loftus's book, The Outsider Test for Faith, which is a relatively simple idea, but his book is brilliant, actually, and it really is worth a read. It's this simple idea that we don't evaluate our own beliefs, certainly in a religious context, in the way that we evaluate beliefs of others or other religions. So as a Christian, I would attack Islam by saying, well, that's ridiculous, and that's ridiculous. But it turns out that the mechanisms I'm using and the arguments I'm using equally apply to my own faith, but I'm not prepared to evaluate my own faith in the same way. So I have double standards, and this is a massive problem. Now, we'll talk about this in the later episode when we discuss hallucinations and visions. But just to give a little sort of soupçon, the Christian will say of the Muslim. So the Muslim believes that Muhammad had a bunch of revelations that were true revelations, and he actually saw visions of the Archangel Gabriel doing X, Y, and Z, and this is basically how the entire religion started, and that's the basis of the entire religion. Right, and they'll say, well, that's ridiculous. Muhammad was clearly having hallucinations, and you say, but hang on a second, because this is what we're saying about the appearance narratives after Jesus was supposedly resurrected. How can you apply those standards to Islam and out of hand dismiss them as mere hallucinations, and then Paul and the rest of the people who have been appeared to have suddenly have veridical experiences that are just not victim to the same kind of metrics of evaluation? It's just double standards.
You know, this is amazing, because from what I understand, Pseudo-Clementine, in one of the Pseudo-Clementine letters, if I'm not mistaken, there's this polemic where Peter and Paul are arguing, and Peter's like, we were taught by the guy on earth. And, you know, we don't know what appeared to you, but this angel of light, and you see this in the New Testament, talking about even if an angel of light appears to you and tries to teach you, whoa, what the heck? So, yeah, I'm with you on the whole Gabriel angel thing that goes on with Muhammad and stuff. We're going to definitely have to get in deeper. Super chats. If you guys want to ask any questions, feel free to super chat them, and we'll wrap things up here. Mr. Monster, thank you for the super chat. He says, have you heard of any rumors that Jesus survived the crucifixion to live on and went to India in Kashmir? Or maybe the entire crucifixion was staged. This goes into Islam as well, by the way, that they don't believe he actually was crucified. Someone else did in his place.
Yeah, so this is where obviously this goes right to the end of the book, which is okay. So if we've picked apart the crucifixion as far as Christians would have it, what could be a probable explanation of the data? And the actual reality is that almost any naturalistic theory that I can give you is more probable than the Christian theory of what happened. So this is actually called the swoon theory, or a version of the swoon theory. So the swoon theory essentially says that Jesus was crucified but didn't actually die, but they thought he had died. Maybe he'd passed out and they thought he had died. They took him down, which is Jewish custom to take down a body before sunset if they think it's dead. And then they bury him in a tomb. But actually he's not dead. And he goes, he wakes up and he goes, I'm alive. So as improbable as that might intuitively appear to you and I, because I'd say, well, that's improbable. That probably didn't happen. It's still more probable than a God-man spirit raised and did X, Y, and Z, X, Y, and Z. There's still, we have, all you need to say is how much evidence do we have of people who have been thought to be dead but ended up not being dead? And if you can think of 10 cases, 100 cases, 1,000, probably a million times where people have actually, I thought he was dead. Like we thought, and on a battlefield, and someone actually, we thought he was dead, but it turns out he wasn't dead. He was just, unconscious for a bit. Or what? This happens relatively frequently,
right?
Mistaking people for being dead. So therefore, the prior probability is actually a hell of a lot higher than how many times have we experienced a God-man spirit dying and resurrecting and blah 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 blah.
Right.
So I don't think it's likely, but I think it's more likely than the Christian theory. Now, I haven't looked into the theories that then take Jesus as then going and spreading the word in India and places. And I know there are quite a lot of theories about that. I haven't looked into them. I do apologize. Maybe you, Derek, know a bit about that. But as far as it being staged, it could have been staged. I mean, what you're trying to do is you're trying to look at the data that you got from the Gospels, and you can try and fit as many theories into that. What you might want to do is look for positive evidence of that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like if we were to weigh it on the scale, so to speak, and we had a choice, and the choice was he somehow survived, or there's a mistaken thing here, or the swoon theory where he's drinking some type of thing that knocks him out, and he goes into a tomb, survives, and comes back, whatever. That's still more probable than the dead rising. Whereas there's still the idea, though, that this guy actually died and just didn't rise at all, but was believed to have. And that's a whole nother thing we're going to get into as to this spiritual resurrection, I think, that Paul has in mind. And then the Gospels take it into more of a concrete resurrection over time. But it'll be interesting to hear both sides. I'm going to see Del C. Allison, a New Testament scholar, Dr. Del C. Allison.
So he's just written on the resurrection, hasn't he? So,
I see him next month, but he knows how to play back and forth. And one thing he did say was he thought if you put a skeptic hat on, that the body being stolen and potentially used, this, I know it sounds crazy for him to even say this, but he said during this time there were people who would use dead bodies for magical incantations, and that his body might have been taken and used in some type of witchcraft type incantation, and some grave robbers is still bodies. So that's something he thinks, right? That's granting that he was actually laid in a tomb, and that he was actually, you see what I'm saying? So there's and I want to take a magnifying glass as we go as to different ideas. Like if we grant that he was in a tomb, how could we naturally explain? If we don't,
Sure, because what we'll come to is the fact that my theory would be that he would be stoned, because actually that's the precedent for people who committed that kind of crime. So blasphemy and treason as the highest form of crime, you would never be given a dishonorable burial. So you wouldn't be, Joseph of Arimathea would not have put him in an empty tomb, because criminals' bodies literally defile the earth. The righteous cannot be buried next to a criminal. So that would never happen. He would likely be stoned, hung up on a post. Which actually we've got evidence within the Bible of being, of Jesus being taken down from the post, from the tree or whatever. So later on, and so that I would have thought that would have happened, and he would have been buried in a criminal's grave complex. And then after a year, a family can come by and take the bones away because they've been ritually purified after a year. And then they can bury them in their own sort of family tomb then, if they so desire. But that's what would have happened. So I don't think an empty tomb featured at all, but we will talk heaps about an empty tomb.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend Brute Facts Podcast, Eddie, thank you for the super sticker, my friend. Go check him out. Subscribe. You know, he says, I'm Christian approved, right? Now, he's not your typical Christian, though, okay? But, you know, I got to say, man, Eddie, you're a cool dude, for real, and a good friend. And Eddie would totally disagree with me at the end of the day on this. But, yeah, go subscribe to him. Go check him out. You'll probably see more discussions from skeptics. He's had Dr. Price on, Richard Carrier. He's Graham Oppie. Like, it's like he likes interviewing atheists more than he does Christians. So you got to like a Christian who likes to do that. I really do. Yeah. Thank you for that, man. I appreciate it. With that being said, let me give everybody one more time a shout out on what they need to do. If they're interested in following along, go get the book. You can get it on ebook, paper, whatever. We're only on page 67 right now. And we're going to go through this entire book in a series of videos here on this MythVision YouTube channel. He has practically 302 pages. We're 67 pages in. This is the first episode, and we're going to get through the whole book. I'd love to see you guys read in advance and say, hey, we're going to read and try and know where Derek and Mr. Pierce are going to go in this episode. But you guys, really, there's so much we can't cover that he does cover in the book. This will be a great way to go if you just can't afford to get the book. But this book is full of knowledge, full of insight, awesome information. I really ask you guys go check it out. Down in the description, you can get it at his publications, down in the description as well, where he has his blog and keep track of his article. He writes all the time. So you guys make sure you check that out for sure. And if you guys want to help me out, and not only help me out, you can maybe help yourself out on appearing on camera. I'm going to interview scholars, like I said, Del C. Allison, Christian New Testament scholar. He's way more critical than typical Christians. He does not fit in line with apologists in his ways of thinking. He goes where a lot of apologists will never go. I'm interviewing him next month. I see Richard Carrier in about 10 days. I'm going to be in California interviewing Dr. Richard Carrier and Dr. Dennis R. McDonald in person. I'm taking questions from those who are Patreon members of MythVision. You could shoot me your questions. And I'll make sure to record them on camera while I'm there. You can end up on a high-definition camera with your name shout out, asking your question to these scholars. And then, of course, it'll be published onto the Patreon early for everyone who's a patron. Down the road, it will find its way to the light outside of the tomb. It will resurrect out of Patreon and enter into the YouTube world. Now, that is a fact. It is not requiring a miracle for that to happen. I'm letting you know. But you also get early access to everything. You guys can private harass me if you want on Patreon, ask me questions, whatever you want to do. That's a way to help me survive and keep doing what I'm doing. And there's hundreds. I could hit load more, but I'm not even going to waste my time. Hundreds of videos that are not there for the public to see yet. They're all on Patreon. Seriously. Thank you.
Do it.
Tux TV. Thank you. Looking forward to part 2. And then me and you will talk off air when we get to knock out part 2. But I love this.
It's it's been a real privilege. So thank you for the time, and thank you for the plugs and all the help. That's phenomenal. I was wondering, and I know we've gone on long enough. Probably people are slitting their wrists through boredom of listening to my voice. But I wanted to, because mentioning people like Carrier, I want to say that I am a Jesus historicist, right? Whereas people like Carrier are mythicists, and in fact, David Fitzgerald, who wrote the foreword, is a mythicist. But here's the thing: I don't think there's really any meaningful difference between mythicism and my kind of historicism. So what I think is that Jesus existed, but this is all we can know about Jesus from the Gospels. 1, he was called Jesus of Nazareth, so he's probably from Nazareth. 2, he was executed in Jerusalem. That's it. So the entire rest of the gospel narratives that are built up around Jesus are effectively mythological. They are legendary embellishment. So that tiny kernel tells us very little about Jesus. So in other words, the difference between, say, me and Carrier is actually very little. because we both agree that the Gospels are not telling the truth. Okay. And as far as my historicism is concerned, I'm probably 60-40, right? I'm not going to die on that hill. I read Carrier's work really with great interest, and I'm not like an anti-mythicist. I'm like, yeah, mythicism could be a thing, actually. Like where Carrier's 60-40 sort of mythicism, I'm 60-40 historicism. But
I think it's 33%. Or
yeah, actually it is. Yeah, 33-60, like 2/3, 1/3. But where I'm like a bit more intuitive on that, like I think there's probably a historical kernel. I think you would have to have. I think it makes sense of the cognitive dissonance and the way that, but then the complete embellishment of the Gospels as it happens is myth making.
Interesting. I would like to add to that character, whoever he was, and I actually side with you right now on this. I'm taking a course with Carrier to try and like reevaluate the question, just because I never know. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I need to just shut the hell up and say, all right, I can't know. I don't know, you know, which ultimately I don't. I'm just saying I lean historicist for many reasons. This guy that named Jesus of Nazareth, that was most likely crucified, must have been very impactful to a small cultic group of people. So whatever he did or said, I would say he was very impactful to them in some way that they couldn't. Cognitive dissonance required them to latch on to him and not let go of him, like maybe Judas the Galilean or some of these other messianic claimants that didn't actually succeed. So I don't know. I add that to my list, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'd love to hit you, but I will leave it for the next one, which is John Dominic Crossan's view of how the Gospels were created, based on exactly that, and he maps it out. And there's such a good quote about his work that just maps out how the Gospels were written. It's just brilliant.
I hope everyone hasn't bled out from slitting your wrist on that. Get those Band-Aids on. Love you guys. Never ever forget. We are MythVision. Till next time, part 2.